Okay, this is a response to Veritas48 and to a lesser extent to Telemantros and Dawahfilms. These three guys are engaged in a project, an internet project, a YouTube project addressed at atheists. It's called The Presumption of Atheism. They're asking these questions of atheists. Veritas48 has now narrowed the field a little bit, which is why this is a response to Veritas48. I was a bit overwhelmed at responding to the entire scope of the original questions in 11 minutes. This has narrowed it down a bit, so I'm going to deal with the narrowed bit. But I do want to respond to some of the rest of it. If I get a chance, I'm going to do a response to Dawahfilms. Not to Telemantros, because, to be frank, all three of them presented the same arguments. I understood the argument when Veritas made it. I understood it when Dawahfilms made it. I then watched Telemantros's his first argument, and I couldn't make head nor tail of it. That's after just hearing the same argument twice. So I don't know. For me, that one didn't work. So I may do a response to Dawahfilms if I get time. This is to Veritas, and this is the bit that I want to respond to. This is Veritas. This is the bit that he's asking us now, that he's distilled it down to.
Further, before I offer any more than what I've given, I want to ask the atheist to first address this issue. I would like the atheist to give me reasons to think that the absence of evidence is actually evidence of absence when it comes to God. We both actually bear a burden of proof in this conversation. Apparently not in the bigger issue of God's ultimate existence, but in this conversation, we both do.
Okay, well, firstly, I want to agree with you on a certain point. I apologise about my voice. I may have to record this in chunks, I think, to give it a bit of a rest along the way. But firstly, I agree with you on this burden of proof thing. You know, it's like a criminal case. You could accuse me of a criminal act, and I can sit there on my hands and say, well, you know, I'm innocent until proven guilty. I don't have to come up with an argument, but it behooves me, does it not, to try and come up with an alibi, to try and show where I was at the night in question. So I agree with you what you're saying. I could play this game and sit there and say, well, no, it's up to you. It's all up to you. But that's not going to impress anybody. I'm not going to convert anybody. I'm not going to make anybody actually question what they believe just by saying that. It's just not going to work. So I agree with you. I think the majority of the burden of proof is on you because you're making the claim. But I think that it does behoove me to try and give my best arguments. It behooves all atheists, all thinking atheists, who are atheists because they've thought about it rather than because that's their default position because of the way they've been brought up. So I agree with that. But you've asked a specific question. Is absence of evidence evidence of absence? And let's be clear on this. We're talking about evidence of absence. We're not talking about proof of absence. Certainly isn't proof of absence, but is it evidence of absence? Well, very much so. It certainly can be. If we go back to that criminal case that I was talking about, if you accuse me of murdering somebody last night, surely one fragment of evidence is the fact that you haven't got a shred of evidence to show that I did murder somebody last night. Of course, it still could be that I did murder somebody last night. I accept that. And it's even more evidence on my part if I can show that I was in a room with 20 people all night long. So I couldn't have been at the scene where you're claiming. But the fact that you haven't got any evidence to back up your claim immediately casts aspersions on what you're saying. Okay, of course, we can all go pulling, analogies out our asses all day long, but they need to be relevant, don't they? And we can all pull up a trivial example of where nobody's gone looking for evidence for something and say, well, that isn't evidence of absence. And that's very true. But is that the case with Christianity? Is that the case with Judaism? Is that the case with Islam? Is that the case for the Abrahamic faiths and Yahweh? Well, certainly isn't. I mean, it's incalculable the number of man-hours that have been spent by the members of these faiths trying to prove their faiths, trying to find evidence for their faiths. And there are many strands of evidence that they've come up with, that they've found over the years, that have long been cast to the wayside. And your position, if what you believed in was a transcendent deistic notion of God, then I'd have a lot more sympathy. You'd start from a neutral position that you just believe there's a creator of the universe that plays no part in the universe, so we know nothing about it. But that isn't your position, is it? You believe in a theistic personal deity with a tradition, a Christian tradition, a tradition that dates back well over 2,000 years. And that gives you a lot of baggage, and it gives lots of sources of evidence, and sources of evidence that have been selectively jettisoned over the last 2,500 years. And let me explain what I mean by selectively jettisoned. When you look at your religious texts, and I'm talking mainly about the Old Testament here, when you look at these religious texts which are part of your tradition, there are parts which are frankly quite embarrassing now. They're clearly not right. Clearly the earth isn't 6,000 years old. Clearly God isn't this kind of humanoid figure that we see in the first parts of the book of Genesis. This is what we're being told. All references to this, all references to Noah's Ark, all references to the Tower of Babel, all references to God in any kind of a humanoid form, having humanoid type interactions with us, are regarded as symbolic, allegorical. And yet, weeded out from that, any parts that refer to God as being all-knowing, all-powerful, any parts that refer to him as being transcendental are latched onto. These parts aren't jettisoned. We hang on to these parts, and they now form some of the fundamental tenets of modern Christianity. But there's no good reason to fundamentally latch onto these parts and jettison the other parts, other than because it suits your case. You see, by way of example, I could say to you, look, there's goblins living on the earth, there's goblins living on the moon, there's goblins living in the dim and distant reaches of the universe. And yes, you can show me, Veritas, that there are no goblins on the earth, and you can show me that there are no goblins on the moon. But all I simply do is say, well, they're symbolic. Those are symbolic goblins. The real core of my goblin belief is that there's goblins elsewhere in the universe, and you have no disproof of that. And absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. But surely the fact that I've had to make symbolic the earthbound goblins and the lunar goblins, that is some kind of evidence that really, that I'm undergoing some kind of process in my belief. And that's a process of having to refine and jettison parts of my belief structure to maintain this coherent position. This position that's out of reach of what you're trying to do. So this is why I said to you that I'd have more sympathy if you had a basic deistic transcendental position and that was it. I'd understand that, because there wouldn't be this baggage that Christianity has. What you've actually ended up with is a schizophrenic God. Christianity has this schizophrenic God. On the one hand, there's this God that is now, to pull it out of the way of science, utterly unreachable and utterly undetectable. And on the other hand, we're being asked to believe that God is actually personal, and he interacts with millions of people, that is detectable by millions of people on a daily basis. Well, these two things don't tally up. This detectable God that speaks to everybody, this personal God. Yes, it made sense 2,500 years ago. It kind of made sense 2,000 years ago. But ever since, it's made less and less sense as more and more has been jettisoned. And now it jars awkwardly, doesn't it? These two things jar awkwardly together. So the last thing I want to do is to try and just sum this up, or at least sum it up before my voice packs up, which is about a 50-50 chance, I think. What I have to say, and this is very telling, is that more and more it seems that sophisticated theists are being reduced to using deistic arguments to prop up a theistic position, William Lane Craig style. Just ignore the man pulling the levers behind the curtain like in The Wizard of Oz. You know, just ignore the theistic shit and we'll try and bundle that under the table at a later date when you're not really paying attention. And I can't help but feel that that's just the latest stage in a grand, centuries-old mimetic evolution that the idea of Yahweh is undergoing, has undergone and is still undergoing now. You give me 100 Christians, Veritas, I'll give you 100 different versions of what your God entails. And this is the key to it, is that as those generations pass on and as new scientific advancements come out, as new sources of knowledge come out, some versions of that just get quietly dropped. They're not the ones that people prefer, they're not the ones that people take on board. And when people do take them on board, like in the creationist movement, the biblical literalists in the United States, it causes a lot of embarrassment to sophisticated Christians, doesn't it? But there's this drive all the time, and what this drive has done is it's made sophisticated notions of Yahweh pretty much undisprovable. So in direct answer to your question, is absence of evidence, evidence of absence? I have to say unequivocally, yes, in this case it is. But not only that, but given the historical backdrop that Christianity exists within. It's also evidence of a manufactured and thoroughly evasive concept of God. Thank you to anybody who's watched this video. Thank you for opening up this debate, Veritas.